Thank you. Thank you for joining me today, however, you're joining me, whether that's on Facebook, through IG, or my friends from LinkedIn. I'm glad that you came. And if you can't watch, at least just listen. Okay. I want to thank my good friend, Mr. Aaron Allen, for bringing this incident to my attention because it gives me a great opportunity to educate new police officers on how they should be interacting with people and a reminder for other police officers to follow your department's policies when it comes to announcing your presence. So, to just dive right in, on September 29th at about 1 o'clock, 1:30 in the morning, a tow truck operator in Decatur, Alabama is attempting to repo a man named Stephen Perkins' vehicle from Stephen Perkins' property. The tow truck operator is allegedly met by Mr. Perkins with a firearm. The tow truck operator leaves, goes and gets law enforcement, tells them what happened, and then they decide to all go back to Mr. Perkins' properties. Now, there's a couple ways this thing could have played out. Ultimately, how it played out was that Mr. Perkins ended up being unalived by the firearms of police officers. That's a lot to take in right from the very beginning. And that's the statement that Decatur, Alabama police put out at the very beginning. But like a good police officer, that's what I read. That's when I found out. And then last night and earlier today, I started to look into it a little bit more. And we're going to get into that. But first of all, let's talk about how, in my mind, if I was the police officer there, how it should have played out. And the first thing is this. When the repo guy comes to me and says, hey, I went to go repo this car, and the gentleman that was there pulled a firearm out on me, having an honest conversation with him, I'm going to tell him, you know the job that you have, and you know the dangers that come with it to a certain degree. Like, you're trying to take somebody's property off of their property in the middle of the night, under the cover of darkness in a very sneaky fashion. Them meeting you with a firearm, that comes with the territory. Okay. But past that, once he tells me this and I decide to get involved, which later on we'll discuss why that's probably not the best way to go about it. When I decide to get involved, when I go back, taking the proper precautions to avoid a situation that could be negative is paramount. Now, let me pause here for a second. Police officers, you have to really, 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 really be mindful that this is a business that you're doing. This is a business that you're doing. And so interacting with members of the general public is a form of customer relations. And so you have to be an extreme professional when it comes to doing these things. You have to go out of your way at times so that you can avoid a negative situation, especially with the way that the media portrays law enforcement as it is today. So back to what I was saying. I go to the man's house. I knock and announce my presence. I'm imagining that he will just come to the door, especially when he knows that law enforcement is there. As a police officer at this point, what the repo man says and what Mr. Perkins would have said in this regard, they matter, but in the same sense, they don't. Because at the end of all of this, I'm telling the repo guy, listen, come back during the daytime, or go back to your boss and tell him that law enforcement said you couldn't take the vehicle at that time. Because I'd much rather have the manager of a repo company calling my leadership, my chief of police, and saying, hey, my guy went to go report a car last night. Your officer told him he couldn't do it, and I have a problem. I'd much rather have to answer questions for that than I would for what happened that night. Okay. Repo guy, like, scram, you got to go. That, and it's what law enforcement said happened is that the repo man came to law enforcement, told them what happened. They went back to the house, and Mr. Perkins came outside with a firearm. Time out. Okay, time out. If that's the case, and here's an opportunity for me to educate the general public about how these situations work. If that's the case, there is no investigation. There's no investigative steps being taken if Mr. Perkins comes outside of the house with a firearm. The only thing we're dealing with at that moment is that firearm that he has and getting him to put it down. We can do an investigation afterwards, but right then in that very moment, no, there's no investigation going on. And as members of the general public, as Americans, it's 100% your right to bear arms. It's 100% your right to protect your property. But you have to understand that when you interact with police officers and you present a firearm or you come out with a firearm, you can almost guarantee with almost 100% certainty that if you do not put that firearm down, you're going to raise the chances of having a firearm used against you exponentially. Like, it's going to be it's a likely outcome that happens. And people who don't agree with that, they typically come from a place of emotion. And you have to understand, as a police officer, the courts tend to side with law enforcement because they understand how dangerous the job of being a police officer is. And you have to take into account, the question to ask is, what's the worst thing, like on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the worst thing that can happen to a police officer while he's doing his job or while she's doing her job? And it's, they could lose their life. They could lose their life by the hands of gunfire. You only make the situation worse by having a firearm out and in plain view. As a police officer, I'd rather know that you have it, because a lot of times, and this is where the courts tend to side with law enforcement, a lot of times when we do interact with people, we don't know if they have a firearm. We walk up to a car on a traffic stop. We don't know if that person has a firearm on them or not. When we go to a house for a call, something like this, or a domestic, or a medical emergency, anything, we don't know what type of weapons a person has and if their intent is to use it against us. So that's why when we see scenarios where police officers end up unaliving other people because they either have a firearm or they suppose that they have a firearm, it's because so many times police officers have lost their lives because of people with firearms that the courts are just like, okay, like, we get it. The courts get it. People don't. People come from a place of emotion. They don't want to listen to logic at times. But the logical thing is this: you're going to put yourself in a bad situation if you yourself, as the member of the American public, bring a firearm out and make it known when you're dealing with law enforcement. Again, you could say all day, hey, officer, I got a firearm on me. Okay. And like I do on traffic stops, like other police officers do on traffic stops, you keep yours where yours is, I'll keep mine where mine is, and we'll have a positive interaction as best as we can for it being whatever the situation is. But if you bring yours out, that means I have to bring mine out. And another thing for the public to understand is this: no police officer is going to be under the barrage of bullets and not fire back. Or no police officer is going to take a shot, so to speak, before letting one off. That's not how this works. Okay, we are covered. We are covered by the law, and unfortunately, unaliving people who have firearms and they present them to us because the job is so dangerous. You have to always, always, always be mindful. even if your emotions are spilling over, that when you deal with law enforcement, there's a certain threshold that you cannot cross. There's a certain threshold we're not going to let you cross when it comes to having a firearm. In this situation, the second scenario, Mr. Perkins comes out with a firearm. They see it. The moment he raises it in a way that would make a reasonable police officer believe that he was about to use it against them, they're going to take action. They're going to take action. One of the questions here in the comments is, well, what about a baton from Regina County? What about a baton? A baton for who? As a police officer or as an American citizen? Because if you're talking about coming outside with a baton as an American citizen, then my question for you is why? But we're going to get into why these things happen a little later on when we talk about making our presence known. Okay, because that changes things if a person knows you're there. Regina says, I was told that non-lethal force was the best. It is. But in this scenario that I'm talking about here, if this gentleman came out with a firearm, then non-lethal force is what there's a use of force. It's like a wheel. It's called a continuum, but some have it as a ladder. There's a use of force ladder. There's a use of force continuum where we go with, verbal commands, and then we go, strikes, and then we go non-lethal, which would be a baton or, when we have our tasers, and then we get up to where it's the firearm. But understand, if you come out with the firearm, then we automatically have to go with the firearm in our interaction with you. Jesus, be with me. Be with me. This is not a movie. This is not a movie. It's not. There's not going to be a standoff where a person has a firearm pointed at a police officer and a police officer has a firearm pointed at them and they're going to talk about it. This is not CSI Miami. This is not the show with Shamar Moore that my family likes to watch. This is none of that. This is everyday life. An American police officer versus an American citizen, and there's firearms involved. Because here's the sad reality for law enforcement. As much as people want to talk about law enforcement taking the lives of other people, here's the sad reality for law enforcement. If you don't take the action necessary to save your life, you're going to go home in a box. Your department and other departments around will come together. They'll give you a nice funeral, nice long motorcade, nice presentation inside the church of your choosing. You'll get to pick your pallbearers, all of these things. And then everybody goes home. And your family is left without a father or a mother or provider. Your family's left without a brother or a sister. There's no other job in the world where that is a likely outcome on an everyday basis. This is why the courts tend to side with law enforcement in their interactions with people who present a challenge that may cost them their lives. On the back half, like I'm doing, on the back half, we can talk about, well, if they had done X, Y, and Z, things may have been different. But the reality of the situation is the vast majority of these interactions are split second. And in a split second, as a police officer, it's your life as opposed to my life. Who's going home? Right? Because a lot of times people take these situations, and in this situation, like Mr. Perkins, people take these situations to another level, not understanding that the likely outcome when they bring a firearm out is that it's going to be used against them. So back to this situation. Again, when Mr. Perkins, if he comes out and he presents that weapon to law enforcement, we're going loud verbal commands to drop the weapon, but that's not going to be like we teach police officers, and I teach police officers, don't get caught in the loop. Don't get caught standing there with loud verbal commands, especially if they're not listening. Somebody's going to have to make a decision. And patience is a virtue, and we teach patience. But what the American public has to understand is, as a police officer, when you're standing face to face with someone with a firearm, there are only a handful of ways that this thing is going to end. And if there's 3 ways that this thing is going to end, 2 of them are going to be negative in the public opinion. 2 of them are going to be negative. The only positive solution is that that person actually does what you say and puts that firearm down. If they do that, then we can move on. Like in this situation, if, and I'm speaking in hypotheticals because we don't have all the information just yet, but if he comes out and he puts the firearm down, then secure it and then conduct an investigation. Because no crime has been committed by coming outside of your house with having a firearm, right? That's a reasonable assumption for anybody that comes there. Regina says police officers don't get paid enough for the stress. This is why the Houston Initiative has become my ministry. Because to be fair, a lot of police officers don't. And it's not always about the money, because there's a lot of training that can be had. I know my friend Aaron Allen teaches a de-escalation training that can be had. And there's other trainings that help you get through the day-to-day of being a police officer and the grind that it is. Because these scenarios, situations like this, are ever present. They are so common. They are so common. And I think what happens to people is that we've been so conditioned to see violence and understand violence and be exposed to violence, rather, that when situations like this happen, we're just like, oh, okay. That's why I spend time taking out time for the members of the general public and my new police officers to have live events just like this. Because there's information that could be gleaned from it. There's things that could be learned from it. It's unfortunate that a man lost his life, but as a member of the general public, how do you keep that from happening to yourself? And as a police officer, how do you keep yourself and your department out of the press? And I don't know if I mentioned it, I'll go back and I'll say, as new police officers, you have to understand, especially my white counterparts as police officers. Lean in for you on this one. You're going to be heavily scrutinized by today's media in 2023 in the way you deal with people of color. Black people, Spanish-speaking people, you're going to be scrutinized if you don't treat them the way you would want someone, if you wouldn't treat your family. Okay, because as we move on and new information has been received, I found some this morning, there's a small video from, of course, a neighbor's camera system. It's 2023. As a police officer, you should be expecting that everything that you do is being recorded, either by your department's body camera, your dash cam, or the millions of cameras that people have on their homes. It's like living in the truth. You have to act accordingly. This is where police officers get in trouble sometimes because they forget that these things exist. Like the men down in Memphis, the 5 police officers, they concocted a story, and minus the cameras that were like the aerial cameras and things of that nature, minus those cameras being around, their story would have been believed. But also, police officers, this is why people don't trust us, because we put out statements without giving all the information. Now, in this case down in Alabama, they have body cameras. They do. But the law says that they don't necessarily have to release them. So they may never come out. And then there's always a ton of questions. Does that look shady? Absolutely, if they don't release the body camera footage. But also understand the body camera footage is only like it's like this big. You know, it's only going to have it's limited on its field of vision. Right? I would love for police departments to start using drones from above to record incidents so that we can get an overview, right? More eyes on the situation as opposed to just a body camera. So understand, in Alabama, they have the body cameras. They don't necessarily have to release them. They can if they want to, but they don't have to. Okay. So as we move on, new information has come out, and what we see in the it's grainy video. But as a police officer, we know the vast majority of the video that we get is going to be less than quality. It's always good when we get good quality video, but we don't. So there's a grainy video, and what it shows is that what appears to be Mr. Perkins with a light, and the police said in the report that he came out with the light on a gun. He comes out from his front with a light, comes into the grass, and almost immediately he's dispatched, right? Like he's met with firearm from law enforcement. So with that amount of information, what that lets me know is that these police officers more than likely did not knock and announce. As a police officer, unless you're serving a search warrant, and there's special units for that most of the time, you must knock and announce your presence. Because if we go back to our scenarios, the very first one I talked about, the repo guy comes to the police officer. He says, hey, this guy pulled a gun on me as I was trying to repo his car. They go back. If they knock on his door and announce their presence, then I can guarantee you almost to a certainty that this situation does not happen. Because from the grainy video, it doesn't look like they knocked and announced. What it looks like is what people in the community are saying. They conspired with the tow truck operator to go back and take this guy's vehicle without his knowledge. But here's where we move into the education part of it for police officers. The repossession of a vehicle is not criminal. That means police should not be involved, at least where I live. But I'm sure a lot of other places have civil matters and criminal matters. And repoing a vehicle, that don't have anything to do with law enforcement. It really doesn't. And as a police officer, you have to know that. You save yourself a lot of paperwork if you're able to go to a person and say, hey, this is a civil matter. You're going to have to go see a judge. You're going to have to go see a magistrate, one of these people, to get this figured out. You're going to have to call a constable to come by. We do this all the time. When couples are together and they live together and they break up, and one person wants to leave and the other person is going to stay, but the person who wants to leave wants to get their stuff, do not call us. We are not standing by as you gather up 6 pair of jeans, a PlayStation, 2 TVs, a microwave, the dog. No. You call a constable to go get your stuff. That's what you do. So in this scenario, knowing that this is a civil matter would have been paramount. Or understanding that this was a civil matter and telling the repo driver that it was a civil matter. Like, hey man, I don't know what to tell you. We don't deal with this. You want to repossess a car, like you're going to have to go through your boss, through court, something. Because the family of Mr. Perkins says they have receipts to show that his vehicle should not have been being repossessed in the first place. So what does that tell me as a police officer? That these officers, if they didn't know about civil and criminal matters, these officers got involved in something that they should have never been involved in the first place. This is how we get in trouble as police officers, when we interject ourselves in matters that don't concern us. There's nothing wrong with going out and doing knock and talks and having mirror encounters, but like this is a defined situation where we were not needed, at least in my opinion. And again, in Alabama, it may be charged to the police officers to do repossessions of vehicles and things like that. I don't imagine that they are, but right. Robert Hughes says, stay in your lane. Yes, as a police officer, you have a lane. And when you get outside of it, that's when you get in trouble. You stay in your lane. This is 1:30 in the morning. There's something else going on in Decatur, Alabama not this. Maybe not, but this certainly is not something that you want to get involved in, because look what happens. Now, no police officer I know went to work that night thinking, I'm going to have to I'm going to unalive somebody. I don't care what people say. I don't care what anti-police people say. That's not how we think. Nobody wants to do that, because now if you look at the situation, then you see, I don't know how many police officers were involved, but I'm sure they're all off of work. And it may be paid leave, it may be unpaid leave, but they're probably all off on administrative leave. And now they have to deal with the fact that they've taken someone's life. And if they're police officers, like most police officers, they live relatively close to where they work. In situations like this that can be avoided, they just have such a dramatic impact on communities. Before, if your relationship with law enforcement was, as a community, now it may almost be unrepairable. Or if your confidence in law enforcement was super high and it comes out that these police officers acted inappropriately, then the seed of mistrust. When I was in my Bible study, I talked about how the enemy comes into our mind and plants the seed of doubt or the thought of persecution. The seed of mistrust is planted into this community's mind about their police officers. And that only grows. That only grows. Then every situation is looked at with scrutiny. Like, well, they did this to a guy, so this could very well possibly be. Someone could come up with a fake story and people will run with it because of what happened to Mr. Perkins. So you just have to be smart. I will reiterate to new police officers, knock and announce. Always make your presence known. Because then that removes the liability from you. If a person, say like Mr. Perkins, comes out and if they come out with a firearm. Now, hang on, let me get to this one here. I got a comment. Don't they teach these scenarios in police school? These seem important. Don't go to civilian situations, or do they at least have to go? So, no, typically civil situations aren't taught because we typically don't get called for them. You would think, but in some situations we do, but not enough. And I wish they were taught, or at least explain the difference between a civil matter and a criminal matter. So no, they don't get taught as often as they should, or if they are taught at all. I know with my academy, the scenarios we focused on were traffic stops. We had a simulator to show, and a lot of more people need to jump into the simulator to see what it's like, how quick you have to make a decision if someone presents with a firearm or with a knife. So those are the situations that are typically educated on or typically taught at police academies. But anyway, back to not being liable. If you would just announce your presence, then the person that you're seeking to have contact with has a decision to make. Do they come out and speak to you, calmly? Even if their emotions are elevated to a certain degree, do they come out and speak to you with elevated emotions? Do they not answer the door? All of these things are possibilities, but what you remove is the element of surprise. This person isn't surprised that you're there because you knocked on their door like the police. Hard, loud. They're asking, who is it? You tell them. They got cameras. They can see, especially in patrol, they can see patrol police officers, big old police across their chest, maybe a patch on their arm, flashlight, gun on their hip. They know you're there. Then it's on them to respond appropriately. We cannot continue to have situations like this happen inside of law enforcement, because right now we are in a very precarious position when it comes to recruiting and retaining people inside of our field. People don't want to do this job because the media has highlighted situations like this. And You really can't blame the media for highlighting situations like this because it is us who gets involved in them. Like, it falls on us as police officers to be better. It falls on us as police officers to do better and to interact better with people from the general public. The media is not going to have a story if this situation goes like the first scenario I talked about. There's nothing for them to talk about. They got nothing to say. It's like, oh, we got to move on. And what happens is they take a story like this, they run it for a few days, they run it for a week, and then it falls out of the news cycle. Meanwhile, the people in Decatur, Alabama are still dealing with it. Robert Hughes says 1 or 2 bad cops can stain an entire police force. Yes. Yes. They can. They absolutely can. And it's so important to talk about it because it only takes one. It only takes one. It only takes one bad interaction between a white police officer and a black member of the community, or a Spanish-speaking member of the community, or even a white member of the community, or an Asian member of the community. It only takes one of these incidents to go viral. The men in Memphis, I'll tell you a quick story. The men in Memphis, when this came out, I went to my local gas station, and there's a man in there. His name is Val. I've known him over a decade. And when I walked in, I greeted him, he greeted me. And then he asked me straight up, looked me right in my face and said, "Are you like those men down in Memphis that did that to that man?" And they were talking about Tyree Nichols. And I was blown away because this is a man that I had known for over a decade. 10 years I've known this man. I've given him rides to work. He's worked at multiple stores. I've been to all the stores he's ever worked at. He knows me to be out in the neighborhood exercising, all of these things. I've known this man for 10 years. And this is what he asked me, because this is the seed of doubt that situations like this put in the mind of American citizens. It only takes one. And as a police officer, you should be interactions. They're not all going to be positive, but you should be striving to have all your interactions end well. It can end with nothing being done. It can end with an arrest, but some resolution that doesn't include unaliving a person if that is an avoidable outcome. And a lot of times that is an avoidable outcome. Sometimes they're not, most times they are. And as police officers, we know that. There are things that we could do to make a situation better. There are things that we could do to help a situation end in a different light. Okay? Treat people, here's a tip for police officers. You treat people the way you would want a police officer to treat your mother or your father or your sister or another member of your family. When I go to places, I think about my family. Yes, there may be circumstances that you have to take action, maybe physical action or something like that. You may have to arrest someone. But how would you want your mother to get arrested? Especially if they're not being combative. If they're being combative, that's kind of a different story. But when a police officer goes to interact with someone, that first interaction is so paramount because it sets the tone for the rest of the interaction and if the investigation has to continue. For example, a domestic violence situation. I could be jaded because I've been a victim of domestic violence, so I could go to a call and a woman says, "Hey, this guy did this to me. He says this." And I say, "Well, ma'am, you know what? I believe him because I didn't seen it happen to people like me before." I could be that way, but I'm not. Because when I think about domestic violence and in that way, when I look at that woman, I look at someone like my sister or my wife or one of my countless daughters. I want to do as thorough an investigation as humanly possible in the amount of time that I'm dealing with these people to make the best decision. Might not always be the right decision. Some people may disagree with it, but the best decision. It's called giving people their 15 minutes. You may be tired. You may be hungry. It may be wet, but the person that you're dealing with, this may be their first interaction ever. And a lot of times it is their first interaction ever with a police officer. You want to make them as comfortable as possible. Because if it's a long investigation, you're going to need them to come to court time after time after time. And there has to be a belief that justice is going to be done if they continue to trust you and trust in the system. That's what I'll leave you with. Treat people like you would want them to treat your family. As a new police officer, this is what you need. You need this book, Dominate Your First Year as a Cop. It's available on my website, www.hi-teaches.com. This is what's going to help you keep your department's name out of the press. This is what's going to help you manage the stress of the job. This is what's going to be your guide. This is what's going to lead you to having a successful, happy, positive career where you don't walk away extremely jaded. There's going to be some jade in it, okay, as a police officer. There's going to be some jade. You're going to see some things that the average American is never going to see. For every one critical incident a person may see, a police officer sees almost 200. And that's crashes, that's unfortunately dead bodies, that's things done to children, all these things. As a police officer, you need to be able to manage that stuff. Dominate Your First Year as a Cop is going to give you the resources that you need. It's written by me, someone who has been in the field for almost a decade. I've been doing this a long time. And what I can tell you is that I wish that there was someone like me, RC, at the very beginning of my career to help me out. Because sometimes when you get into law enforcement, it's expected of you to figure it out by yourself. And for some scenarios, that's okay. But when it comes from transitioning from being a police officer back to being, I'm Officer Hughes, but sometimes, like when I get off of work, I got to be RC again. And for a long time, I struggled with that. And it led to a lot of bad decisions that I made in my life because I wasn't prepared. I'll be honest with you. I wasn't prepared for the monster that law enforcement can be when you don't have anyone around you to help. When you have to figure it out for yourself, it's not always the best way to go about doing some things. So the book, Dominate Your First Year as a Cop, is that resource that's going to help you out. Robert says, you really need to be a trainer. I am a police coach and a public resource, meaning I don't just focus on helping out new police officers. I do live events like this for police officers and for the general public as well. Because that's where the Lord has taken me. That's what my ministry is. My ministry is this. This is my ministry. This is how I spread the gospel. This is how I am a resource to law enforcement and to the general public. This is what the Lord has called me to do. So I educate new police officers on how to prepare for this job and how to be successful with books like Dominate Your First Year as a Cop, right? I educate members of the general public with my ebook, Surviving the Stop. I go into high schools. I do traffic stops, DUI, and binge drinking. I go into college level classes and teach policing 101. I do these things because the communication between law enforcement and the general public has become so frayed at times that a regular situation gets taken out of proportion because of fear. Believe, as a police officer, on my Twitter, my personal Twitter page, there are countless pictures of police officers who have lost their life this week. It's Friday. I can remember probably 5 already, whether in law enforcement, corrections, already. In Philadelphia, 3 police officers just got ambushed. We see this every day. This is what we have to deal with. This creates a level of fear. And from the general public side, stories like Mr. Stephen Perkins, unfortunately, stories like Tyree Nichols, stories like George Floyd. This is what causes fear. And what happens is when you get 2 people who are ridiculously afraid of each other together, bad things tend to happen. That's why I exist. Because I want those bad situations to become non-existent. Like, I want people to understand that one bad police officer is probably not that police officer you're going to meet that day. Right? You're going to meet a regular person who himself or herself has fear about, if you're dealing with a black person, has fear about you as a black person. I'm the perfect person for this job because I'm both a police officer and I'm black. It's basically the same fight in that good police officers, good black people don't want to be judged or mischaracterized by the actions of those who choose to do wrong. I'm not one of those police officers that goes out and tries to hurt people, that tries to persecute people, that, uses racist tactics when I interact with people. I'm not one of those guys. I don't want to be judged that way. I'm not one of those black folks who engages in the sale of illegal narcotics, who engages in the unaliving of other people, who has a victim mindset, who blames other people for their problems, and who has a total disrespect for law, the rule of law, and government. I'm not one of those black people either. And I don't want to be judged that way when I interact with people who've never met a black person. Because trust and believe, a lot of interactions between police officers and black people are their first interactions. When I go to classes and I teach the ear model, no knock on you as a police officer if you grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood and there were no black people around. You can't help where your parents raised you. Same, black people. In Youngstown, Ohio, there were just a handful of white kids in my school, just a handful. And I don't remember ever having an interaction with a white police officer until I was 19 years old. And it was a negative interaction. It was a negative interaction. But again, when you become a police officer, you have to become a public servant. That means you have to be able to deal with people from all races, all demographics, all socioeconomic statuses. And as a black person, you have to understand everything you see on the internet is not going to apply to you when it comes to dealing with police officers. That cop that you're dealing with right then and there is probably just a regular person, probably scared to death because the media has done that to him and because other police officers have done that to them. Both sides are begging for a positive interaction. They're begging, please don't let this police officer be like what I see on television. And until we get to a point where we can understand that that's not always the case, then there's work to be done. So I want to thank you all for joining me. As usual, we end in prayer. Bow your heads with me if you can. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day. Lord, thank you for removing me and allowing me to be used as a messenger to not only further your word, but Lord, to educate the people of this country. Bless the family of Mr. Perkins. Bless the police officers and their families, as I'm sure persecution is rife on both sides. Lord, we ask you to bless this country. We ask that you bring us all together in accord, in unison, to live a happy and healthy life, a peaceful life, where one day the need for law enforcement in the way that we are is not necessary. Lord, we ask you to bless us as we continue on through our day. And I want to say thank you for allowing people to come and join me in this session. These things that we ask for, Lord, we ask in your precious and holy name. Amen. All right. Thank you for joining me again for this education session, for this live about Mr. Stephen Perkins. If there are more situations, if there are things that you want explanations on, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube. You can find me anywhere. Let me know. But what I do want to say is this: as I search out, you as well, bring me some positive. In the Bible, when I had Bible study with Elder Mark Callion, we talked about governors who were so quote unquote law enforcement officers at that time. The role of a governor is to punish wrongdoers, but also to uplift those who are doing good. And that's what I want to do. I don't always want to have to talk about a negative situation. I want to have examples of positive situations too. So bring those to me as I look for them myself. They exist. Here in Pittsburgh, we just had Coffee with a Cop, something I participated in 2 years ago. It was a great experience. And what it did for police officers was show them like, okay, not all Black people hate us. Because you get the interaction in that scenario where there's coffee and there's donuts and things of that nature with people who are coming to get on the buses. You get that interaction. It's like police officers walk away like, there's still hope, and there is. Thank you for joining. The ebook, Surviving the Stop. This is where I tell you what your rights are. You don't have to go fishing them out through all the muck on the internet. I'm telling you right now, inside of the ebook, Surviving the Stop, I'm telling you how to interact with police officers in a regular traffic stop, during a DUI investigation, during a crash. You have rights, but I guarantee you probably don't know what they are because you don't know who to believe. I'm doing this as a public resource. Get to the site, get the book, get both books. Black Friday is coming up. We're going to have a massive sale, but don't wait for Black Friday. But again, I'm just letting you know ahead of time. Black Friday is coming up. We're going to have a massive sale, right? This stuff's going to be flying off the shelf. You don't want your book to be on back order, so might as well get it now. I'm RC. I'll see you next time, folks. Bye.